Hello and welcome to the DGHT meeting in Frankfurt, and I'm really happy to have you as a speaker for the New Caledonian, for your research, and Aaron, it's your stage.
First of all, I do apologize that I will speak in English, and because I have a lot of slides, I will probably speak in English very quickly. But this is a talk that hopefully, if you're into New Caledonian geckos, you will have lots of pictures to look at that will keep you happy. I also need to warn you that I flew in at 8:30 this morning. I've never done that before, flown in and given a talk the same day. I've always had at least one night, so if I fall over in the middle of the talk, you'll forgive me. So what I'd like to do today is run through a chronological history of the discovery of geckos in New Caledonia, and I'll go first through the sort of older history, and then when we get up towards more modern times, I'm just going to focus on work that I've done with my colleagues, because that's the work that I know best. So I don't mean to cut anybody else out who's done work in New Caledonia, but I'm kind of focusing mostly on dead people first, and then I'll be focusing on work that I've done. So 2 centuries of gecko discovery in New Caledonia. I'm only 61, so I'm not responsible for the most of that, but a little of that. So most people here will know something about New Caledonia. New Caledonia sits here about 1,300 kilometers off the coast of Queensland, Australia, and about equidistant between New Guinea and New Zealand. And it's made up of the Grande Terre, 3 main and several smaller loyalty islands, the Isle of Pines, the Belep Islands here, and a few sort of isolated reefs to the north and to the west. And there's just a little bit of an idea of some of the views, the habitats in New Caledonia. So New Caledonia is still a French territory. There is still colonialism in the world, and France still controls New Caledonia, which sits at the southern edge of the tropics. You can see that New Caledonia is only about 1,600 square kilometers. It's mostly mountainous. It's been a land mass for over 100 million years, but as I'll mention in a minute, it hasn't been above water for all of that time. And so when we look at the geckos that occur there, we're really concerned with when this was above water. New Caledonia is known mostly for its mineral riches, especially nickel, but other things as well. But from a biological perspective, it's a place that has been recognized as a hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot. It has high floral endemism. It has probably even higher faunal endemism. And one of the nice things about working there is it only has 271,000 people. So it means that it's possible to get to places that don't have too many people. So this is the southwestern Pacific, and there's Australia, New Zealand, New Caledonia. And this area in the Southwest Pacific, which is sometimes referred to as Zealandia or Tasmantis, is now believed to have been underwater until about 37 million years ago. And in fact, the work that we've done on molecular dating shows that the gecko fauna there is more or less under 20 million years old. We used to think it was a truly ancient fauna that was maybe as much as 100 million years old. But it now appears that things were completely overwashed, and both the geckos and the skinks, but also many of the other animal groups that occur there are actually relatively young, and all of this biodiversity has evolved in a relatively short time period. So just another quick view of New Caledonia showing rainfall here, give you some idea that in some areas on the east coast, like in this sort of cloud forest that we have up in the upper right, you get very high rainfall, up to 4 meters of rain a year. In other places, as you can see in the upper left, in the far north of New Caledonia, you have much drier conditions. So there's a lot of variation in environmental conditions. So I mentioned the endemism of New Caledonia. There's actually almost 3,300 species of plants in New Caledonia, of which 74% are endemic. 108 endemic plant genera and 5 endemic plant families, which is a really spectacular number. Examples include Ambarella, which is the sister group to all other flowering plants. We also have endemism in things like birds, with the national bird, the kagu. And in skinks, for example, Uganglene skinks, we have 20 genera, of which 17 are endemic, and 65 species, of which 62 are endemic. So the herpetofauna certainly has a high level of endemism. So in addition to the skinks, the terrestrial herpetofauna of New Caledonia, aside from a couple of typhlopids and one boa, are diplodactylid geckos and geckonid geckos. I won't be saying much about geckonid geckos because there are only 6 species and 5 genera, and none of them are strictly endemic to New Caledonia. However, the diplodactylid geckos, there are 65 species in 8 genera. There are still 5 undescribed geckos that I have on my shelf to describe, including a new genus, which I'll show you at the end. And 100% of these are endemic to New Caledonia. So for a gecko person, New Caledonia is a really wonderful place. So this is the distribution by number of these endemic diplodactylid geckos. We have Bovia with 41 species plus 1 yet to be described, Edidura with 1 species plus 2 to be described, 4 Rhacodactylus, 3 Coriolophus, 2 in a new genus, 9 plus 1 Dairogecko, 4 Urodactylodes, 1 Panier gecko, and 1 Niaro gecko. And I'll say a little bit more about those of you who prefer a traditional Rhacodactylus with all big geckos in one genus. I'll say a little bit about why I don't use that anymore. So to take a step back beyond the 2 centuries and look at when, in fact, people began interacting with the herpetofauna of New Caledonia, we can go back to the Lapita pottery culture, where people arrived in New Caledonia somewhere around 3,600 to 3,200 years ago. And during that time when they arrived, they interacted with a megafauna which no longer exists. And they probably had something to do with the extinction of that megafauna. We know for a fact that myelinaeid turtles that we see down here, giant horned turtles, did overlap with people, and there are remains from human midden sites. So we know that people actually interacted with these. They may or may not have interacted with Micosuchine crocodiles, which you see up on the stamp on the top, but probably these lived in New Caledonia till at least, let's say, 3,000 years ago, maybe a little bit later, and so probably a good chance that people also interacted with those crocodiles. The human interaction, early human interaction, the Melanesian interaction with squamates, probably a little less interesting, right? The myelinaeid turtle or a Micosuchine crocodile would make a good meal. Most geckos and boas would not make such a good meal. However, we've been doing work on fossil sites and subfossil sites in New Caledonia, some of which are associated with human middens, others of which are from owl pellets. And we find lots of gecko and skink remains here, including the ones that are associated with people. So even if people weren't using them, people were sort of living in very close proximity to these geckos. And again, at the end, I'll say a little bit more about this and indicate that we have at least one undescribed species that coexisted with people that we have fossil remains for. So lizards did actually play a role in Kanak culture, and the Kanaks are the native Melanesian people, and they still do play a role. Giant geckos are the totemic animals for a number of tribes, and it is taboo for other tribes to talk about the beliefs of the tribes that are using these animals. So Rhacodactylus leachianus is sacred in a number of different tribes, for example, on the northeast coast. Geckos do appear in a limited way in some artwork, these carvings, for example. And according to early European records, Kanak people actually did eat giant geckos, at least in some places in New Caledonia. Today, there are many beliefs associated with the giant geckos. Modern Kanak people often fear giant geckos. In a rural area, people are often afraid of these. Giant geckos are referred to as chameleons, and people believe that they will rip your skin off if they touch you. And there's also the belief in southern New Caledonia of a giant gecko that flies. I remember my first trip to New Caledonia, everywhere you went, people would talk about this. And no, they'd never seen it, but they knew somebody in another village who had. So sort of widespread mythology or widespread folklore about these giant geckos. So if we get to the European interactions in New Caledonia, the European discovery of New Caledonia was on Captain Cook's second South Pacific trip. They landed at Balade on the northeast coast of New Caledonia in 1774. They spent 9 days there, and then they sailed down the coast and they went to the Ile de Pin. They made no herpetological observations, although the naturalists on board the ship on the Resolution were Johann Reinhold Foster and his son Georg Foster. They did other herpetological work, but nothing in New Caledonia. But they did still have, Cook still had an influence on New Caledonia because he gave pigs and dogs as a gift to the local people, which almost certainly has resulted in the extinction of a number of different things, and certainly in the degradation of the habitat of many of the species that occur in New Caledonia. So let's get to the first discoveries. The first discoveries in the early to mid 19th century. So very auspicious start. Cuvier described the first gecko from New Caledonia, and perfectly appropriately, it was Rhacodactylus leachianus, right? If you're going to start with a gecko, you might as well start with the biggest one. And so Cuvier described this in the second edition of Règne Animal in 1829. There's nothing known about where this came from. The specimen had no provenance with it. And I always love this. I point this out to my students. That is the entire description of Rhacodactylus leachianus. So you end up with this huge floppy gecko that is very distinctive, and all you can say about it is it has smooth skin and some wide toes. But I guess in 1829, you didn't really need to be much more specific. Fitzinger comes into the story because in 1843, he erected the genus Rhacodactylus to accommodate Cuvier's Asclepiades leachianus. But things really begin to pick up in the middle part of the 19th century. In 1853, the French declared New Caledonia to be a French territory. There were both French and British interests, as well as other countries that were whaling in the area, and the French decided to claim it in that year. And the first resident missionary was Montrouzier, who was also a naturalist, especially an entomologist, but he did describe Boa australis, and now a synonym of Candoia bibroni from the Loyalty Islands. And he did talk about geckos, although he didn't describe them. He did talk a little bit about the natural history of geckos, especially from the northern offshore islands and also from the Loyalty Islands. And then most of the contributions came from French naval personnel, which sort of makes sense. If the French have just taken over the island, they need to maintain a military presence there. The naturalists who were involved from the French military were mostly botanists, or were mostly considered themselves botanists. So Villard, who was a physician, was 10 years in New Caledonia, and Desplanches, who was a surgeon, also working for the Navy, was there for almost the same amount of time. And both of them collected widely, both animals and plants, but Desplanches collected the type of the second described gecko, which is Coriolophus ciliatus that we see down there. So again, we're kind of makes sense. We go for the biggest, and then maybe you could say the most spectacular of the geckos are the things that were first described. This is another member of that French military group. This is Henri Jouin, who was a naval captain. He was more interested in ornithology and ichthyology and geology, but he did say something about herpetology. And in fact, his observations on the herpetology of the Île Belep in the far north of New Caledonia were the only herpetological observations there for well over a century. But in 1863, in the paper that you see on the right, he mentioned only 3 species of lizards in New Caledonia, 2 of which were geckos, basically a small gecko and a large gecko, not really giving any names for those. And at the same time, Desplanches and Veillard, who were the other people I mentioned, the physician and the surgeon working for the Navy, referred to the herpetofauna of New Caledonia as very poor. So at this point, without really doing much work, people sort of wrote off the diversity of New Caledonia, thought it wouldn't be very interesting. But of course, none of these people were specialists. None of these people were especially interested in herpetology. The first person who was Bauer, and Bauer was yet again a naval employee. He was a pharmacist that worked for the French Navy. He actually was particularly interested both in malacology and in herpetology. And interestingly, maybe, all of these people that I've mentioned from the French Navy, they all came from Normandy. That gave rise to all of these French naval naturalists. And in 1869, he did the first monographic treatment of the herpetofauna of New Caledonia. And for people who are interested in bibliography, the sort of interesting thing that there's 2 versions of the work, nearly identical, one in 1869 and the other in 1872. So if you are collecting New Caledonian literature, you need both of those. He recognized 11 species of geckos, so he started to dispel this idea that the herpetofauna was not very diverse and not very interesting. And of course, ultimately, Bauer became the namesake for the genus Bavaia, one of which is represented here, which was eventually described by Roux in 1913. So this is just a list of the geckos that Bauer included in his monograph on the reptiles. And just to give you an idea, the 2 triangles are New Caledonian endemics that were already described that he included. So that would be Leachianus and Coriolophus ciliatus. And all the blue dots are species that he described as new in his 1869 work. So by the time he was writing, he recognized 4 of the 6 geckonid gecko genera, 7 of the 65, or 4 of the 6 gecko species, 7 of the 65 diplodactylid gecko species, 4 giant geckos, so people got onto those pretty quickly. Those were obviously the prizes for herpetologists. He described the first, what would eventually be Eurodactylodes. And the one thing he didn't do was he didn't really recognize that Bavaia, which turns out to be by far the most species-rich genus on the island, they didn't really recognize that it was in any way distinctive. The Bavaia were sort of lumped in with either names that belong to New Zealand species or names that belong to other geckonid geckos that were widespread in the Pacific. So these sort of little brown geckos got very much ignored up until this point. So although we had a number of herpetologists that were spending time in New Caledonia, a few years or up to 10 years or more for some of these naval personnel, this period of sort of discovery was followed by what I would call the era of the armchair herpetologist, where most of the work, most of the descriptions were done by people that never got within thousands of kilometers of New Caledonia and described material that was sent to the museums in Europe. So one of the first of these to be described was Peripia cyclura, which eventually became Bavaia cyclura, described by Günther at the British Museum in a separate publication, but then also redescribed with a bit more detail in this book on the cruise of the Curaçao in the South Seas. Also describing things that were sent at this time were Bocage from Lisbon and Sauvage, who was at Boulogne-sur-Mer in France. And Bocage described Rhacodactylus trechirhynchus. He also described Rhacodactylus aubrianus, which has now been synonymized with Leachianus, and he described a synonym of Bovia cyclura. Sauvage was a little less of a herpetologist, more interested in paleontology and ichthyology, but he did describe a Hemidactylus, the type of which is shown here, which is also a synonym of Bovia cyclura, which was described, as we saw by Günther, just a little bit earlier. And then one of the greatest of the armchair herpetologists was Boulanger. And Boulanger began, before he left for Britain, he described Chameleoneurus trachycephalus with this nice plate that is shown there, which ultimately was synonymized with Rhacodactylus trachyrhynchus, but has turned out actually to be a valid species. Boulanger also did an entire revision of the geckos of New Caledonia in 1883, published in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society of London. And there's the list of the 14 species that he recognized, with one that he described, only one was new, which was Lepidodactylus sauvagei, today Bovia sauvagei. So we went from a maximum of sort of 2 species recognized back by Juin in 1863, up to 14 being recognized here in 1883. And again, Boulanger's paper had a number of plates, including ones focusing on Rhacodactylus, and another plate, some of the image of which are shown there, that focused on Bovia, and particularly he recognized the foot differences in those species. And then the last of these armchair herpetologists was Anderson in Stockholm. And Anderson published in 1908 this description of Urodactylodes, at the time Urodactylus symmetricus. And you can see the live animal there and his illustrations of that. And those were really the first illustrations of really quite a spectacular and very different looking gecko. Although Bovia had described it in 1869, described another species in 1869, he didn't illustrate it. So I think most people were unaware how distinctive that animal was. The sort of biggest contribution up till this point had been this trip, a big expedition by Saracen and Roux that took place in 1911 and 1912. And Fritz Saracen was really an independently wealthy collector and naturalist in Basel, who, along with his cousin, conducted a variety of expeditions to different parts of the world. He was a very broad naturalist, interested in zoology, geology, anthropology, and he worked in this case with Jean Roux, who was at the museum in Basel, who was a herpetologist and also a protozoologist. And the two of them went from February 1911 to June 1912. And on the map, you can see New Caledonia and the Loyalty Islands, and the red indicates areas that they went at that time. And they covered quite a bit of, or at least a representative bit of the island, certainly got much deeper into the interior than any of the earlier people had. Saracen actually authored the narrative of the expedition with both German and French editions of this, and it included this photograph of what appears to be a preserved Rhacodactylus leachianus on a tree trunk, but it might be the first actual published photograph of a New Caledonian gecko. And at the bottom, you see one of their landscape, one of Saracen's landscape photos. It's a different area, but not too far away, that I put a modern view on the top. Some of the landscapes have not changed very much. And what's interesting about their work was they went at a time when traditional Melanesian life really was probably not that different. And the population of New Caledonia was not that different than it was pre-European contact. So they were seeing, to a large extent, especially in the more remote areas they went, they were seeing a New Caledonia that looked like New Caledonia had looked maybe for 2,000 or 3,000 years before. So this is Roux's contribution, although Saracen wrote the narrative of the voyage, Roux published this famous work on the reptiles of New Caledonia. This is Roux's contribution in this series, Nova Caledonia, which was covered a diversity of faunal and floral groups. And the list here is the list of the species that were recognized by them. And in this case, Roux recognized 3 new subspecies of Bovia, and of course, Roux described Bovia for the first time, recognizing that these little brown geckos in New Caledonia were not just Lepidodactylus lugubris, or were not just some other small, widespread house gecko, that despite their similarity, these were something that was special and unique to New Caledonia. So they began to pick up on the diversity. And included these as new subspecies. They also added in Rhacodactylus saracenorum, adding yet another giant gecko to the list here. So they recognized 19 taxa of geckos, that's species and subspecies. And this work by Roux really served as the standard reference for New Caledonian herpetofauna for 75 years. Both for geckos and skinks, this is what you had to go to. When I first went to New Caledonia, this is what I had to use. I had to use something from 1913 as my primary reference for what was going on there. This is why I worked on New Caledonia, because I was so excited that there was a place in the world that had been ignored for so long that there would be such interesting things to find, I thought. So these are the things that Roux described. There's Rhacodactylus saracenorum on the left. There is Bovia crassicollis on the right. There is Bovia montana and Bovia ornata, all of which were described as subspecies. So I mentioned that that was a standard for years. So what happened in the in-between period? What happened after 1913 for the next 75 years? So in this period, we had relatively little work being done. It was sort of sporadic. So F.X. Williams, who was worked primarily in Hawaii on insects, was in New Caledonia during parts of World War II. Apparently, always fascinates me that the Americans set up a huge staging area in New Caledonia and apparently actually behaved themselves. And when you go to New Caledonia today, people generally, older people that actually remember this or remember their parents interacting, actually have a positive impression of Americans, which I don't know how you can do that, but they managed. But he did collect some reptiles, and in fact, in a paper that's entirely devoted to something like Hymenoptera of New Caledonia, there is a picture of a live Rhacodactylus leachianus for no apparent reason, but it's one of the earlier photos that has appeared. The next sort of kind of name that comes up is Heinrich Bregula, who was a German ornithologist, naturalist, and collector. He worked in Melanesia from 1959 to 1980. He was known mostly for his work in Vanuatu, and he's known mostly for birds. But in New Caledonia, he actually directed the Parc Forestier, which is the zoo, and started successful breeding programs for a variety of birds. But he collected reptiles that were sent to the Senckenberg and elsewhere, and mostly not paid much attention to. But he did send live animals that people did pay more attention to. In particular, he sent Rhacodactylus leachianus to zoos and other institutions as early as 1962. And I'm indebted to Rene Honegger, who was unable to come to this meeting, but he sent me some information. The first Rhacodactylus leachianus that he received at the zoo in Zurich came from Bregula in 1962 at 140 Deutschmark per pair of leachianus. So that was the time to get them, I guess, early on. And that's really, as far as I'm aware, the origin of captive propagation of giant geckos in Europe comes initially from the animals that were brought back in the early 60s. One of those animals, or several of those animals, were written about by Robert Mertens, who did this paper on the giant geckos of the genus Rhacodactylus. And I just sort of take a second time out here to sort of say that this is, for me, the most important paper ever written on New Caledonia. Because when I was a graduate student, I went to the library at the university at Berkeley, and I said, I'm going to try to look for some place in the world that I can work on geckos that will be interesting. And what I found was Mertens' paper from 1964 about Rhacodactylus. And that sort of pulled me in to find what I could, to discover Roux's work, and to recognize how little had been done on New Caledonian reptiles. So that's a happy me, still with hair, with a black beard, not a white beard, that at about that time, in 1983, 84, really, when I started to work on New Caledonian topics. The only real change taxonomically that happened during this period was Heinz Vermuth did a replacement name. He recognized that the name Eurydactylus that had been applied to these very bizarre sort of chameleon geckos in New Caledonia, he recognized that that name was preoccupied by a beetle, and so he erected the name Eurydactylodes in 1965. So that was really the only nomenclatural change between 1913 and 1988 for geckos. So you can see why in 1983, 84, when I was looking for a project, I thought, wow, this is untouched. So when we get to the late 70s and the early 80s, things start to pick up in New Caledonia, and there's more and more interest in New Caledonia. So I said I will mostly talk about work that I've done myself just because I'm familiar with that. But I'll mention here Harold Meyer, who had important trips in 1975 and 1978, collected new skinks that were eventually described, and he brought back living Rhacodactylus that entered zoos and entered the private terrarium trade, and also contributed to what was going on with Rhacodactylus in the terrarium world, and really renewed interest in New Caledonian geckos. So this had been, sort of a decade and a half after Mertens' work, and I think it reminded people how interesting these animals might be. So, as I said, these were sort of seminal things that got me interested in working in New Caledonia. So this is just a sort of popular piece that I wrote about geckos in the genus Rhacodactylus, but lots of people got interested in Rhacodactylus, and I include here just a partial selection of books, mostly based on captive breeding, and but also including a lot of natural history, husbandry information, etc. Rhacodactylus really began to take off as people sort of learned more about it and recognized what an interesting group that this was. And this is, obviously, it's not my area of research, and my area of professional interest, but obviously Rhacodactylus became very, very popular. That first nomenclatural change since 1913, other than Vermuth's recognition of Eurydactylodes, was done by Ross Sadleir. And Ross is an Australian herpetologist, and he and I have been working together in New Caledonia since about 1990. We worked sort of independently at first, but Ross in 1988 described Bovia validoclavis, which you see up here on top. This is a little tiny, sort of very nimble, jumping gecko, and subsequently we recognized that it belonged to another genus, but at the time it was described as validoclavis. Ross also raised Roux's subspecies to full species, so Crassicolus, Ornata, and Montana were all then recognized as full species, largely just recognizing the change in the way people looked at subspecies at the time. He also described in that same year Bovia septuiclavis, and for those of you who know septuiclavis, this is probably a sort of an exceptionally nice-looking individual, a very yellowy individual. They're not always that attractive looking. But this is a widespread gecko in the southern part of New Caledonia. Shortly after, Zeip and Obst described Rhacodactylus leachianus henkeli, and we also have the rediscovery of Rhacodactylus ciliatus, originally Coriolophus ciliatus, after about 110 years. It was originally found on the Isle of Pines, but shortly after on the Grande Terre as well, and now we know that it's very widespread in New Caledonia. And in less than 30 years, it went from being considered extinct to being the fourth most popular reptile in the pet trade worldwide. Second in geckos, second only to leopard geckos. So that's a pretty amazing success story for something to go from extinct to be one of the most well-known geckos in the world. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a description of a variety of different geckos, and I'll just sort of kind of run through these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but just if you don't know Bovia, I'm going to try to get you to believe that little brown geckos actually do have some interesting diversity to them. We started off describing the ones that were the most different or the most recognizable. And that included things like this, Bovia exuxita, which lives in sclerophyll forests, which are endangered in New Caledonia. Bovia pulchella, which can be very strikingly marked like this individual here, or they can have almost no pattern. In 2000, with some students, we described Bovia gaetana. You might say, why, this looks like a typical normal Rhacodactylus to me. The thing that stood out to us about this was it has more markings on the back, more typically 5 or 6 sets of markings on the back rather than the typical 4 that you see in a lot of Bovia. We also described Bovia robusta, which is the largest of the Bovia, the biggest specimen, which is in the ZFMK collection in Bonn, is, I believe, 91 millimeters snout vent length, which is a pretty giant Bovia. And then in 2000, we also described this animal, which turned out to be very interesting. This is described as Bovia majo. It was 2 specimens, and they never really looked like Bovia to me. I wasn't really comfortable with them being there. And once we sequenced them, we recognized that, in fact, this had very little to do with Bovia. It just happens to also be brown. But other than that, it was really not closely related. In 2000, Ross and I published this book, The Herpetofauna of New Caledonia. We recognized 26 species, 6 geckonid geckos and 20 diplodactylids. And the ones that I've got there with the blue circles are ones that we described not in the book, but in the run-up to the book. In the couple years before the book, those were described as new. So we're starting to get a recognition that the fauna is pretty diverse. 26 species is not bad. Shortly after the book came out, it was immediately out of date because of Henkel and Böhmer's description of Urodactylodes agricolae, shown here. And then in the early 2000s, Tony Whitaker from New Zealand, who you see down here, did a bunch of environmental impact statements and studies that were commissioned by the provinces in New Caledonia. And he was a really incredible field man who was willing to put in the time necessary, got into the most remote places, and found a lot of interesting things. And from his work, we recognized that the species that we had recognized in our book were just scratching the surface. He had turned up many, many new things in many remote localities that we hadn't been to at that point. And amongst the things that he turned up was these little nimble geckos, the first one of which I mentioned had originally been described in 1988 as Bovia volidiclavus. Here in this paper that we did in 2006, I recognize this as a different genus, a new genus, Dairogecko. These are miniature species, and they are essentially limited to the far north of New Caledonia, where for the most part they live on these ultramafic mountains, these mountains very high metal content, and each colored dot there represents a different species of Gecko. And here you can see some of the diversity in these animals. They're all kind of the same general body form, and they're all quite small, but they do differ from one another. And those are the other species in that genus. And I'll just mention that one of them, Inexpectatus, that you see in the middle on the bottom, actually lives sympatrically with Pumensis, the one that you see on the far right. So these things can be found on the same bushes, on the same hillside, on a single isolated low mountain, about 400-meter high hill in northern New Caledonia, and they are the most genetically divergent of all members of that genus. So that was quite a big surprise. We also discovered this thing, which again sort of looks like a bovia, but its toes are completely different. And again, when you see the animal in life, you recognize something's not quite right. We describe this as Edodira marmorata, and there's another example of that. And this is a species that we have two more of, or genus we have two more of to describe, that also occur on areas in the far north of New Caledonia. We hopefully will get those described in the next year. Moving on through the 2000s, we described some more bovia, again, focusing on the ones that were kind of maybe easier to recognize. This is a miniature bovia cyclura group animal. This is Bovia goroensis. It occurs only on the Goro Plateau in the south of New Caledonia. And this is Bovia nubila, which occurs only in the Mount Zumak area, also in southern New Caledonia. And they're both quite distinctive. So at this point, taking us to around 2010, 2012, I recognized that we kind of really needed to be more systematic in the way that we looked at the New Caledonian geckos. Instead of just describing these one-off, we needed to kind of look in detail at whole groups to figure out where there were new species. And so we did this starting in 2012 with this paper that was a revision of the giant geckos of New Caledonia. And in this paper, we developed a new phylogeny for these geckos. We resurrected Rhacodactylus trachycephalus that Boulanger had described from the synonymy of Rhacodactylus trachyrhynchus. And we ended up recognizing 7 genera of New Caledonian diplodactylid geckos, including 2 new genera and 1 resurrected genus. And we described 2 new species of giant gecko in this paper. So those 2 new giant geckos were from the far north of New Caledonia. This is one of them. This is Gecko jalu. And this animal, which is very closely related to Gecko kahua, occurs where the red dots are in the far north of New Caledonia and also on the Belep Islands, whereas the more well-known form occurs further south where the green dots are. The other giant gecko was Coriolophus belepensis, and this one seems to be strictly endemic to the Belep Islands, only in the far north. And although these may look a lot like Ciliatus, they are genetically as diverse or as divergent from Coriolophus ciliatus as are any of the species of Urodactylodes from each other or any of the species of Gecko from each other. So these are actually fairly genetically divergent, despite the fact that they look very much like Ciliatus. So I'm not going to go into great detail into the phylogenetic tree, but what I want to point out here is why they're not all Rhacodactylus anymore, and that is because the different groups of giant geckos turn out not to be each other's closest relatives. So down at the bottom, in green are true Rhacodactylus, so that's Leachianus, that's Trachycephalus, Trachyrhynchus, and Auriculatus. They're down here. The 2 species of Gecko are in fact more closely related to Urodactylodes than they are to Rhacodactylus. And then Coriolophus is up here, also not terribly closely related. And then Panier gecko, which I just showed you that one photo of, which is I think our only life photo of that animal, is off on a branch on its own, very distinct from the other brown geckos, little brown geckos of New Caledonia. So that's sort of very briefly kind of why we don't lump them in Rhacodactylus anymore. A few more additions were made. Urodactylodes occidentalis, which occurs primarily in sclerophyll in rather endangered habitat in New Caledonia, and Diurogecko baba, which occurs only on eel baba in the far north of New Caledonia, yet another species in this genus of little jumping geckos. And then the only kind of really big point of interest in geckonid geckos was this description of Gehyra georgpodhosti, which was described from the Loyalty Islands and Vanuatu. There had been known that there was a gecko there. It had always been referred to as Gehyra vorax, which is really occurs in Fiji. But this paper by Morris Flex and others identify this as a distinctive regional species. So it's not endemic to New Caledonia per se, but to that area, New Caledonia and Vanuatu. So in 2016, we did another phylogeny, and this one is a better phylogeny. Let's say we used more genes for this and greater diversity. We get a different answer about how some of these things are related to each other, but we still end up with all of those giant geckos being not each other's closest relatives. So we still end up with Niaro gecko and Coriolophus being in a separate group and Panier gecko also being in a separate group. But the group that's shown in top, that's in red, that's Bovia. And you can see that there are more Bovia than there are anything else. And this was something that we'd been working on for a long time. You saw some description that we had done as early, Ross's descriptions as early as 1988. And we actually had a good phylogeny for this group as early as about 2006. But this was just a monumental effort, probably the most difficult thing I've ever worked on, to actually describe these things, because we knew they were genetically distinct, but you needed to look at an awful lot of them to actually be able to find diagnostic features that separated these. So in November last year, I published this revision of Bovia in which we described 28 new species in this one paper, and there was one that was described in a separate paper, came out just before, one that we didn't have genetic data for. So this is a group that I would refer to as a non-adaptive radiation. You tend to think of things like Darwin's finches or anoles as being groups where you have all of this modification to live in different areas. I'm going to make the case that Bovia don't do that. Bovia have a lot of diversity, but that diversity is not really related to living in different ways. It's related to living in a very fragmented habitat. So how many Bovia are there? In all of the previous work we had done since about 2006, we always came up with far more potential species than were actually out there, that were actually sitting out there with names. And that data came from a number of different sources. So we used things like DNA barcoding, but we also used a lot of nuclear genes. So we had data from a lot of different sources that really suggested that the number at that point, 13 Bovia, was really an underestimation. So we decided to sort of take the bull by the horns and look at all of these. We looked at about 600, I think in the published paper, we looked at 600 individuals of Bovia that we sequenced. And for specimens, I looked at 3,000 specimens. And between Ross Sadlier and I, we spent 5 person years in the field in New Caledonia. And it took that much effort to actually try to sort this group out. It really was such a difficult group to deal with. So there are some things that separate groups of Bovia pretty simply. Different toe pads, different sort of morphological variants in the way the claws are positioned. Bovia cyclura group animals are generally bigger, heavier bodied, and sort of have a yellowish venter. Bovia sauvage group animals are smaller, more slender, and have a whitish or brownish venter. But to separate out all of the lineages that we thought we had found, we really needed to focus on things like the details of color pattern, the details of things that are a little bit more amorphous. to figure out what was going on. And here's little trees that you can't read, but they give you the overall kind of take-home message. We recognized that within the 3 generally recognized clusters of Bavaria, there were in fact many different subclades, including some subclades that had been totally overlooked, where we had no representation at all of these. And this just gives you a list. I don't want to bore you with the details of it, but it just gives you a list of the different groups, the different clades in the group, and how many species were in those clades. So if you look, just for example, in the Bavaria cyclura group, let's try that again. In the Bavaria cyclura group, we had one new clade, entirely new clade with 6 species in it. We had a new clade in the Savaggi group with 3 species in it. And then in most of the others, we've added additional species as well. So some of these were brand new, were novel Bavarias. Others were ones that probably had been confused in the past, and we were, after looking at enough of them, we were finally able to kind of sort them out. So that's a summary of Bavaria. And it gives you an idea of some of the diversity in that group. So this is all 41 of the species of Bavaria, plus there are some that are represented a few times if there's some diversity there. But when you throw them all up at once, you get some idea that they aren't all exactly the same little brown geckos, and probably Juan back in 1863, when he thought there might be one small gecko, was really, really off base. And we had been off base for a long time as well, until we kind of went through and kind of really looked at these in detail. And I'm just going to show you some of these new species. Again, you know, unless you're a Bavaria freak, you might just sort of look at them as little brown geckos, but hopefully you can appreciate the subtleties of these. This is Bavaria Stephen Parkey. This is Bavaria menazi, which occurs, like many of these, on a single mountain. This is Bavaria cugni, which is a widespread species in the south. Bavaria centralis occurs in the Chêne Central Mountains. Bavaria chingu also occurs only on a single mountain and is related to the smallest of the clades. This is the Bavaria ornata group. And then this is Bavaria Jordani in the Bavaria montana group, which tends to be one of the bigger and maybe more impressive of the groups. Bavaria cocoensis, this is a member of a previously totally undescribed clade, mostly from the north of New Caledonia. And Bavaria rhizophora, named because we collected it in mangroves. And this is a member of the Bavaria crassicollis clade, and also a very large Bavaria. So how do you accommodate 41 species of congeners in a space that's smaller than Hessen? How do you do that? How do you fit that many species in a relatively small area? So one of the ways that you can do that is to recognize that within Bavaria, the 2 biggest groups are Bavaria savaggi and Bavaria cyclura group. And as I showed you before, they differ in pretty obvious ways. Bigger, smaller, yellow belly, whitish belly, different toe pads. So almost any place you go in New Caledonia, you can pack in at least 2 Bavaria by putting 1 each of those clades, right? Those are going to be different enough that they can divide up their world perfectly well. And if you take a look at this, you see on the left a Bavaria savaggi group. I took off some of the species identifications just to keep it a little simpler. And on the right is a Bavaria cyclura group. And you can see that there are areas of endemism that are essentially overlapping, that you have species with the same distribution in both of these main clades. So that explains in part why we can fit some of these things in, but doesn't really explain how we can fit 41 of them in that space. Another way that we can do this is if we look at the geological background of New Caledonia. I mentioned that it's got a lot of mining activity, and nickel and chromium and other metals are important there. The soils in which those metals occur are relatively toxic, and they have a very highly specific, very highly endemic flora that occurs there. And that then translates into very highly endemic insects and ultimately to highly endemic geckos that occur there. And so on the left-hand side, you see the colored patches representing areas of New Caledonia that are ultramafic background, that are going to have these sort of metal soils on them. And you can see there's a big chunk in the south. And then as you go up, especially the west coast, we have a bunch of isolated massifs. And that's another way that we can fit these things in. We can look here at the Bovia cyclura group and see that those isolated massifs, which have these particular edaphic conditions associated with the underlying geology, each one of those massifs has its own endemics on it. So not only are we fitting one cyclura group and one sauvage group, we are also adding specialized endemics, sometimes mid to high elevation endemics that are going to occur on those. And in the south, other groups occur that occupy that whole big block of ultramafics in the south. So we have a really good idea that if we look at the underlying geology, we can make a pretty good prediction about where we should find localized endemic species. And that's really kind of what the last decade of work has been up to, has been kind of identifying those where we should expect to find unique species and making sure that we've sampled there. The other thing that plays a role is the vegetational history. So New Caledonia basically has two main vegetation types. There are others, but the two main vegetation types are humid forest and maquis vegetation. And what you see here is the maquis vegetation in orange and the humid forest in green. And in the past, you can see up on the very top, is the original distribution of these vegetation types, pre-human distribution of these vegetation types. And what you see below is the modern distribution of these. And most Bovia are humid forest species. And as maquis expands, and although it has done that because of human activities, it has also expanded and contracted and expanded and contracted again and again in pre-human times. And when that happened, the isolation of humid forests pretty much separated species of Bovia from one another. So you end up with species that are living exactly the same life in two patches of forest and end up losing gene flow, losing all genetic connectedness between them, and they begin to move off in opposite directions. And so that's why I think of this as a non-adaptive radiation. Although we do have, let's say, 5 or 6 different types of Bovia that you can easily recognize, a lot of those are actually, within those, you find species that are next to impossible to tell apart. I can tell them apart because I've looked at thousands of them. But they are hard to tell apart because they live exactly the same lifestyle, one mountain over, separated by 6 or 8 million years of inappropriate maquis habitat in between. So this is sort of a little kind of model of how that might happen. On the right-hand side, you see changes in sea level, changes in dry periods over time, and this is over a relatively long period since the Eocene. So this is really covering most of the period that New Caledonia has been above water since it was inundated. So this is the period that we're concerned with when we actually would expect to have geckos on New Caledonia. And all you really need to see is those lines on the right are moving back and forth. We've gone through periods that were drier, that were wetter, that had higher sea level, lower sea level, and those have either favored maquis or they've favored humid forest. And essentially, when the maquis takes over, it results in the separation of a once ancestral population of Bovia. And over time, if we go from kind of top to bottom, we go from having a lot of the same thing in more or less continuous humid forest to divisions of groups caused by this maquis separation, and finally what we have today with many of these species living in complete isolation from one another with no genetic connectedness. So all of those things are contributing to this. Some of it has to do with just sort of filling niches with different sized animals. Some of it has to do with the different sort of geological background, and some of it has to do with this fragmentation that's probably taken place. And I just want to point out here that this results in this extreme microendemism. So that's what New Caledonia is all about. It's about fitting a huge number of taxa with tiny distributions into this relatively small island. So if we look on the color map there, you see the Bovia cyclura group, and each circle is surrounding a different species, in this case in the Montana clade. If you look, you see rather similar circles on the left. The left map is areas of plant endemism within New Caledonia. So this affects not only geckos, but almost everything that occurs in New Caledonia seems to show evidence of this microendemism. And the same areas are repeated again and again. And a lot of those are mountains, but some of them are not. Some of them are other areas that are unique in some way. And the result of all of this is that there's a huge conservation implication for this. New Caledonia fauna is at threat from many things: wildfires, mining, land clearing, urbanization, deforestation, afforestation, and a lot of introduced species. Things like deer and pigs are everywhere and destroy the understory. And I didn't talk about it, but some of the groups, like the Bovia cyclura group, pretty much rely on daytime retreats on the ground. So those are destroyed by things like pigs and deer. We also have cats and rats involved in direct predation, ants that are causing problems. They can prevent geckos from breeding in some areas. And some exotic geckos, some of the geckonid geckos, may also cause problems. And when we evaluated all of these new species, it turns out of the 41 species of Bovia, 6 are near threatened, 6 are vulnerable, 20 are endangered, and 9 are critically endangered. And as I'll kind of end up with in a minute, I think that's a very telling thing. There's something, some story that comes out of that. So before I finish up, I want to say a little something about some other discoveries in New Caledonia. What I've kind of focused on, as you can see, were the description of new things and kind of how over time the recognition of the fauna went from being a relatively poor fauna to something that is incredibly diverse and has resulted in descriptions of new genera as well as new species. So some of the other sorts of things I want to mention is, one is there are more and more people in New Caledonia itself who are interested. For example, these are publications on the left that were actually made in New Caledonia. They include some things like kids' books, like Marguerite Mon Ami, but they also include Guide to the Lizards of the Grand Sud in New Caledonia, works that are being sponsored by mining companies and other things. So there's a greater recognition by people there that there's interest. And then a kind of global interest, this series, Zoologia Neo-Caledonica, which is published by the Paris Museum, is now up to, I forget, nine volumes, each one full of stuff on new descriptions and other things. So there's a lot going on in New Caledonia. There's also a lot of papers, and these are just some of my papers, but other people's as well, dealing with other aspects of biology, not just description. So I focused on descriptions, but we're learning more and more about the biology of these animals as we go along. This is a study done by one of my students who looked at Rhacodactylus auriculatus at Parc Rivière Bleue and looked at their distribution on kind of a fine scale in their diet. I had another student, and Peter Sound and I were just talking about this, who's unfortunately, her work still remains unpublished, where she looked at radiotelemetry of Rhacodactylus leachianus and Rhacodactylus trachycephalus on Ile Moro and near the Isle of Pines. So we have interesting biological data available as well. And then a couple of things to finish up with. We found very extensive subfossil remains from the west coast of Pindai, and this shows a bunch of elements that are there. There are skinks, there are diplodactylid geckos, there are varanids, which is of interest, but there are no geckonids. So this might help answer the question, those 6 geckonids in New Caledonia, were they there before, or were some of them there before, or were they all introduced either with Europeans or with the Kanak people when they came? So we can't really answer that, but we can say that 2,000 years ago, this large accumulation of reptile bones from owl pellets does not have any geckonids that are in it. We also have an interesting thing that Rhacodactylus trachyrhynchus, which for me is probably one of the more difficult species to find, was the most abundant species in these owl pellets in the West Coast, a place where today it barely occurs. So there was a different ecology not that long ago, probably altered in part by people. And one of the more interesting things is this. This is a diplodactylid gecko that is something brand new. Totally new, does not fit any of the existing species. Might have been something sort of like a miniature Rhacodactylus, but we really don't know. We're about to try to sequence these, see if we find out something interesting there. And then for me, probably one of the very most interesting recent discoveries is this. This is a giant gecko in a different genus. You can see it here. This animal on the left is 150 millimeters in snout vent length, so it's a pretty big gecko. That's its skeleton. And if you look at its skeleton, it's still skeletally immature. Still has room to grow at 150 millimeters. And this animal lives in central New Caledonia, steep forested habitats, we sort of beat ourselves up that we never found this after dozens of trips to New Caledonia over a period of 40 years, but we found it this time in a creek in the middle of a creek on a rock. So this is almost a semi-aquatic gecko. We found aquatic beetles, amongst other things, in its stomach contents. And I collected this very spot in 1990, 1992. No hint of this, but of course, I wasn't out at night shining my lights into the center of a creek looking for a giant gecko. I was looking up in the trees. So this is a really exciting discovery, I think. This aquatic behavior is relatively rare in geckos, but something like it is actually known in Dactylocnemus from New Zealand. And this species actually has some similarities to Hoplodactylus delcourti, which is the giant extinct gecko that we thought was from New Zealand at 370 millimeters snout vent length. So we have sequenced this new gecko. It does turn out that it does fall in the New Caledonian radiation, but it's not in any of those other giant geckos. It is yet again a separate origin of gigantism within New Caledonia. And the other thing is we got two specimens of this. One was clearly a very young one, and when we sequenced it, we realized not only is it very young, it's also a second species of this. So we have two new species of giant semi-aquatic geckos from New Caledonia. And hopefully that paper, although I've been trying to get it done for some time, hopefully that paper will be submitted this summer. Then the last thing I want to mention is this. This was actually the first gecko I ever described. I guess I had self-doubts and I thought I better start with something that I'm sure is different. And so I've described this giant gecko, which I described as being from New Zealand. It's known from a single specimen, a stuffed specimen in the museum in Marseille. And I described it as being from New Zealand because its digital structure was very similar to Hoplodactylus, the New Zealand genus. Well, after many tries, we finally were able to sequence this giant gecko. And it turns out it's a member of the New Caledonian radiation. But we don't know that it's actually from New Caledonia. It could still be from New Zealand. We just know that it's a member of a radiation that is otherwise in New Caledonia. And the reason why I kind of hedge a little bit about New Zealand is the New Zealanders, the Maoris, had some folklore that described something very much like this, the Kawakawia, which was described as being essentially about this size, being about 600 or 700 millimeters long, and being sort of brownish with reddish brown stripes on it. In New Caledonia, I've never come across any indication of people knowing of giant geckos that were larger than Leachianus or giant geckos that looked in any way like this. Doesn't mean it couldn't be so, but it is a question of where this thing might have come from. But it is another derivation, and it is yet another example of a separate evolution of gigantism in the New Caledonian radiation. So we're actually up to 5 independent derivations of gigantism within the New Caledonian gecko. So I think that's a pretty exciting discovery. So to wrap up, in 1975, there were 39 species of geckos that were recognized in New Caledonia. We have 136 today. And the book that Ross and I wrote in 2000 is off by about half. We've described about double the species in the last 20 some odd years. And I mentioned before about the microendemism, and I just want to finish with that and point out that if conservation managers in New Caledonia used what we knew in 1975 as their basis for how to save their herpetofauna, they would have done everything wrong, because they believed that there were relatively few, mostly fairly widely distributed species. And what the last 30 or 40 years have told us is New Caledonia is full of these microendemics, and if you shave the top off of one mountain when you're mining, you're going to lose 1 or 2 or 3 species, and there are no other places where they occur. And so, on the one hand, I think this is something that the New Caledonian government has sort of taken into account, and they become a little more stringent in some ways about what they expect mines to do and how mines need to justify what they're doing. On the other hand, I do think that it is still an issue that conservationists have to wrestle with. When you have these microendemics, when you have taking up almost any place you want to do something, any place you want to exploit, has something that only occurs uniquely there. It's a unique problem. It's a special problem for conservation. So I think that that's going to be a challenge going forward for New Caledonia. So that's sort of our little sortie through the history of New Caledonian geckos, sort of how we get from 1 gecko in 1829 to 136 geckos in 2023. And I just want to end by thanking both students and colleagues from Villanova, but also my colleagues in New Caledonia and from around the world for their contributions for all of this work. And also thank Felix for inviting me, and Renee Honegger, who I mentioned, provides some unpublished data about Brachydactylus that he had. And with that, I will finish up, and I will happily take questions. So thank you very much.